welcome to Pedder Unplugged. This is the podcast all about the people who were fortunate enough to have visited the original Lake Pedder prior to its controversial flooding in 1972. This is where the Pedder people share their stories, adventures, trials and mishaps of visiting the lake, and how the devastation of losing a natural icon has influenced the rest of their lives. I'm Tabitha Badger, and today I'm joined by Paul Basil O'Halloran. Basil is a teacher, he's an environmental activist, and from 2010 to 2014, he was a Greens member of the Tasmanian Parliament for the seat of Braddon. Basil candidly shares his formative years and his involvement in the energy and dams debate, as well as what a future for Tasmania with a restored Lake Pedder could look like. If you're after an optimistic way to kick off 2022, then this episode is for you. Enjoy Pedder Unplugged with Paul Basil O'Halloran.
As a young boy, I grew up immersed in the rainforest of the Tarkon, essentially, and was always kind of attracted to it and always gained a lot of peace from the rainforest. As a young kid, I can kind of remember that. And I started school. My father was a strong Labor man. My mum really didn't ever divulge her political instincts, but I guess she was a Labor girl for sure. My dad became mayor of Wynyard later on. I went, along with my brothers, I went to Braddon Primary School, which only went through to grade 9. And then at the end of grade 6, it was always recognised that my brothers and I would head off to boarding school because we were so remote and there was nowhere else for us to go, essentially. And so I spent 6 years in a very cruel boarding school in Burnie called Morris College. And that had a profound impact, I think, on me as a person because of the nature of the education and the cruelty that was there. Your whole education was based around fear of being caned or fear of being abused, or, it was an awful place to learn. And also the teachers were hopeless. But somehow I kind of survived, and I survived mainly because of sport and friendships. I made really strong friendships in those days. And because I was reasonably okay at sport, I was quite well accepted and I wasn't bullied like most other boys were. My younger brother was very badly abused though at Morris College, along with hundreds of others. And so it's taken up a lot of my time in the last few years. So when I was in Parliament, I was instrumental in getting the Royal Commission to sit in Tasmania. And that was mainly because I knew of the abuse that had happened at Marist, and I know a lot more now than I sort of did then. So I went okay academically, and the only way that I could go to university was with a scholarship. Like we were quite poor, really. And as it turned out, I was the first person in my family to go to university. And so I got a studentship to do teaching and studied a science degree. And so I majored in biology and geology, and then did a dip ed after that and then went teaching. But it was in those years, though, that I started to find my feet. So I came out of boarding school very insecure, lacking confidence, too frightened to stand up and talk in front of people. I never, ever in a million years prepared to put forward an opinion of any sort. But university kind of changed that, particularly sort of towards the third and fourth years. And then I got involved in the Vietnam War protests, so that was all raging in those years. I got involved in university demonstrations and politics a bit, and that then led to a walk into Lake Pedder. So I still lacked a lot of confidence, and I would avoid standing up in tutorials or in lectures or putting my point of view, which would surprise a lot of people, really, even in the way that I am now. But that's exactly the way that I was. And socially, I wasn't very well prepared socially either, in terms of relationships with girls and women. But that was starting to change as well. So things were going along pretty well. And in 1972, as Lake Pedder was being flooded, I was starting to become very environmental. And I think it was sort of went back to my days spent on the edge of the Tarkon. Mum and Dad still lived there, and I used to love going home and walking in the rainforest. And the opportunity came up to walk into Lake Pedder just as the dam was being shut off. And I'm pretty sure it was early 1972. And a couple of friends of mine, Chuck Clark, who I shared a house with, and another guy called Reece Boucher, who I'd studied with, decided to do a day trip into Lake Pedder from Scotts Peak Dam. So we drove from Hobart, got up really early, and off we went. And we trudged from the Scotts Peak Dam right into Lake Pedder, and we spent this magnificent hour and a half on that drop-dead gorgeous beach. and then we turned around and walked out. And I think it was round about, like I think in those days it was 9 miles each way. So it was quite a hefty 18-mile return walk and then a drive home to Hobart afterwards. But that had a profound impact on me, and it really aroused my environmental feelings. So the day that we walked in, it was overcast, but there was not a person. The beach was there, so it must have been summer, probably heading into autumn. The beach was 200 metres wide. It was absolutely stunning. And you had all the ranges like all around it. You had this absolutely iconic little lake with this magnificent beach. It's really impossible to describe the beauty of the place. It's a bit like sometimes when I go into a piece of rainforest which has got myrtles and man ferns and blackwoods, and it's so quiet and beautiful. It was even more of that kind of feeling that I get when I go into rainforest. Like, it was absolutely unbelievably beautiful. And the three of us were in awe of standing there and just certainly thinking how lucky we were to be probably, in the last few people who would actually stand on that beach, because the dam had been shut off and the waters were rising. And, there might have only been like maybe another 20 people because that was coming into winter. And we were lucky enough to stand on it. But also then the sense of sadness, knowing that in 6 months' time, that beach was going to be underwater. And we'd lost something that had brought so much, so much peace and so much sense of beauty to all of those people who managed to make that trek in the preceding 50 years, really. And I guess those people also flew in and landed on the beach and saw it. So it was a very limited number of people who actually saw the original Lake Pedder. And I was lucky to have seen it, and I'll do everything I can to make sure that people in the future get an opportunity to see it as well. And that's why I think this project is so important. So even though that was lost, and needlessly so, it really made me become very active. And so by then I was kind of hooked in, and I really wanted to do something to save special places like Lake Pedder. My first teaching appointment posted to King Island, and I had two wonderful years on King Island where I really got into surfing and did a lot of hiking, a lot of beachcombing. But I was also by then really, really engaged in the forestry debate. So at that stage, Guns had just opened their woodchip mill at Tribunna, and I could see clearly what that meant for forests in the future. So even though the promise was that it would only be branches and twigs, it was very clear to me that it was going to be whole trees and forest devastation. And that is exactly the way it turned out. And I can remember I led an excursion with some King Island kids to the East Coast, and we visited that Tribunna woodchip mill just as it started up, really. And it became even clearer then when you could see the log trucks coming into the mill exactly what our forests were destined for. So I got really, really engaged in the forestry debate, but I still hadn't joined a political party. So even though I was kind of aligned to the UTG and then later the Green Independents, I never thought it was for me, really, because I just still didn't have the confidence. I didn't think I was a good fit to make a difference in that way.
Was it primarily the energy debate that drew you to go down the Franklin, or was it the love of nature, or to see somewhere that was at risk of more unnecessary environmental devastation, or what initiated the trip?
I wanted to have a look at this place that was about to be lost
to
inform myself what it was. Just before I got married in 1982, a couple of friends and I rafted the Franklin River. And that was really back quite in the early days. And I was just blown away by the magnificence. Every corner you sort of rafted around, there was a new vista which just blew you away. And that continued for 6 days, even though it was hard. We had to do the high portages on that trip. That was a life-changing experience, as well as the walk in the Lake Pedder. So that was probably the second pivotal sort of environmental event in my life. And I repeated that a couple of times after. So I've rafted the Franklin now 3 times, one with my brother, my younger brother, who I travelled overseas with. And we travelled in those small rafts, and we were actually guided by the Bob Brown guidebook.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty awesome, really. And I still didn't know Bob at this stage, although one of my closest friends now is a guy called Chris Fletcher. So Chris Fletcher had kayaked down, I think it was around about 1979, so it was 2 or 3 years before me, and he dislocated his shoulder running down into the Erebus. And
Ooh.
you'll never guess what happened. The next person who came through was Bob Brown, who was a doctor, and Bob tried to put Chris's shoulder back in, and I think he did manage to get it back in. And Chris was then helicoptered out. So Bob had a radio that was able to get help, got Chris out of the Franklin River, which is pretty amazing, really. So
Wow.
before the whole Franklin thing, it absolutely convinced me that this place was like absolutely a global treasure and needed to be left for future generations, and just the whole beauty of the place. And so it was that. It was also the sense of adventure. I mean, it was quite adventurous and into water sports a bit. And just being out in the wilderness with friends is in itself very therapeutic. And that's the way that we found it. So the 3 of us are now still best of mates. Like 40 years later, we're still best friends. And so then what happened, and then with the blockade, I was actually away overseas when that was on. So I missed the big blockade. But it was such a sense of relief on the 1st of January 1983 when the High Court determined that the Franklin would be saved, even though Robin Gray continued to fight for its damming. And even though Robin Gray turned down in 1982 $500 million in compensation not to build the dam.
Wow.
Like, it is truly scandalous that would now be worth like billions, literally $2 to $3 billion, which is actually 1 year of our state budget. And he was cheered on by both Labor and Liberal. And it was only the Green independents in the Parliament of the time who once again were on the side of right in wanting this place saved and wanting Gray to accept the $500 million. And we could have absolutely transformed this state way back 40 years ago if that money had been accepted. I mean, we could have invested it in a world-class education system, in quality public housing and social housing. We could have become an environmental centre of excellence. And all of that was lost with the pathway that they were determined that we would follow, and in fact, which we did follow. The energy debate, the dams debate, that was Pedder and the Franklin, then morphed into the forest debate. So with North Forest Products starting up the woodchip industry in the early 70s, and then guns taking over, I was becoming seriously hostile to the politicians of the day in terms of the way they were wrecking the place. And sort of leading us down a path that I thought and many other progressive thinking people thought was the wrong path for this beautiful state to follow. There was a federal election in 1993. It was the one that Keating won, beat John Howard. I turned up to vote in that election. There was a lady, I remember, Pip Pace, who worked for Di Hollister, and she was handing out how to vote cards. And I said, where can I join up? And that was when I joined the Greens. And then I decided that I would get serious. So I sort of made a decision then that 1 vote out of 25, because by then they had reduced the numbers in Parliament from 35 to 25 to get rid of the Greens. Yep. Di Hollister was a casualty of that, along with others like Christine Milne. And so I stood in 2002 as the lead candidate in Braddon. And that was the one that Peg was the leader, Tim Morris, Kim Bird, and Nick McKim. It was Nick McKim's first time that he stood, and the other 4 lead candidates got elected, and I just missed out. Like, it was such a surprise that I kind of got so close, where I needed pretty close to 17% of the vote. So there wasn't any disappointment in that, really, because I expected to lose. I stood again in 2006. And once again, just narrowly missed out. Late 2009, we were looking around for candidates, and I said that I wasn't standing. I got a call from, guess who? Bob Brown. And Bob said, Basil, you're the only one who can win this seat. Would you reconsider? And so, of course, I did, and got elected in 2010. So that's when I became Member of Parliament for those 4 years. My son, Thomas, then he'd taken a gap year and he'd gone ski bumming in Canada. So he'd gone back to Canada. And my wife, Angela, and daughter, Claire, had booked to go to Canada to ski with him. The night of the election, when I found out, it took 2 weeks. It lingered on before we found out that I'd actually been elected. It was out of Brett Whiteley and me to get the 5th seat. And it was quite critical because Labor had won 10 seats, Liberals had won 10, Whiteley would have given an 11, and then it was 10-10-5 to us. And so we were then kingmakers. On the Thursday night, it was announced that I'd been elected. So Angela and Claire were in Canada. Bob Brown called me up and said, congratulations, Basil, that's fantastic news. He said, what are you doing? And Bob had actually been at Liffey with Paul, and they'd driven back and they were down at Baghdad when he called me. And I said, I'm sitting here alone, just enjoying life, really. He said, wait there, we're turning around. And they came back, spent the night with me. Isn't that awesome?
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, like he spent 3 hours going back to Baghdad, and then he'd turn around and he'd spent 4 hours driving back to spend the night with me at North Melbourne. So we had a fantastic night there. And so then I was elected to Parliament. So that's kind of how that happened.
And what a time for you to be in the Parliament as well. It was really at the pointy end of.
Yeah, it was. So by now I'd become very, very involved in the Gunns pulp mill debate. And I must say the main reason why I stood for Parliament was to deal with the destruction in the forests, and the destruction particularly that the pulp mill was going to put on the forest. So it was going to be a native-based forest pulp mill, and it absolutely was going to devastate any remaining native forests in Tasmania. And so all 5 of us were of the same mind that we wanted to bring to Tasmania a more socially just future, and that included education and housing, but also a more ecologically sustainable future, and that included forestry and energy. Even though both Labor and Liberal now denigrate those 4 years, they were very progressive years for Tasmania, and a lot of fantastic stuff was done around climate change, around the environment. And as you know, the Tasmanian Forest Agreement was signed. I mean, it was a very long-winded process. It was very collaborative. In the end, signed this agreement with the Tasmanian Forest Agreement, which set aside 600,000 hectares of our most beautiful forests. So that was an amazing thing to happen. And every Greens member in that Parliament, I mean, they had lots and lots of terrific things that we were able to go to the next election with. Nick was a fantastic leader and did a lot to keep it together. It was very difficult to keep it all together because when you're in a balance of power, cooperative type situation, you don't get everything that you want. So just by definition, balance of power means compromise. And so it's difficult to get the compromise right all of the time. And so you give ground on some issues, but you don't give ground on others. And you need to determine the things that are non-negotiable and the things that were negotiable. And I think we trod that line quite well. It's a great outcome. And there are lots and lots of other great outcomes in it, which I won't go into now, but Nick was the Minister for Education, and there was fantastic things happened in public education in those times. Cassie was in charge of housing and social housing and public housing, lots and lots of fantastic stuff. Tim Morris was the Deputy Speaker. So, we were able to wield a lot of influence. So it was a good time of government, and I think it actually shows that balance of power situations work. They work all around the rest of the world, and I think absolutely they are the way of the future, because without that, we won't get cooperation, we won't get people talking about issues and determining policy based around facts and evidence, not around what your donors can influence you to put in place.
You're absolutely right. The Greens are in the balance of power, as you say, right across the world, particularly in Europe. They've got a stronghold and that's exactly what we need to make the pivotal change that's necessary in the present climate and biodiversity crisis. And if it wasn't for those 600,000 hectares that was protected as a part of the Tasmanian Forestry Agreement, Tasmania would certainly be in a far worse off scenario than we currently are. We're very lucky to have had that set aside, and so we can at least claim net zero.
Yeah. Now, just coming back to that issue of the logging and the 600,000 hectares, mainly because of the hard work of all the players like the NGOs, the TWIS, there's a whole number of groups and so many committed individuals over decades of hard work, forest protesters, dam protesters, river protesters. It was their hard work that got us to this stage where we were in a position where we were politically savvy enough to be able to do this, and we had enough people supporting us to be able to pull it off. So, everybody who's been out there, demonstrations and on the Franklin protests, way back to the Lake Pedder protests, then the environmental protections, particularly around forestry, that we have achieved is down to all of those people. So if you ever feel that protesting doesn't work, in the end, it will work because right is on our side, absolutely. And in the environmental crisis that we face now, particularly around environmental degradation, the state of our oceans, and especially climate, it's critical that people have a voice and protest, because in the end, it's going to work. And the old paradigm, the system that we've got, where you're having governments bought off by vested interests and the corruption of our democracy, eventually right will prevail. And we will get elected to our parliaments, people who care about the future and they care about the planet and they care about the kids, our kids, and they will get into a balance of power situation. And I think it's coming very soon. It's happening in Europe and it will happen in the rest of the world as well. And I think Australia will be the next place at our next federal election, that we are going to get a balance of power situation where we've got environmental campaigners and socially just and environmentally sustainable campaigners and elected politicians who will bring about the change that is needed so that we don't destroy this planet. So, they're all good things. And people like you and people like Peter and Nick and, Cassie and Rosalie, they're just high quality people who are totally dedicated to the cause of environmental sustainability and a socially just future.
One thing that we've found in the Restore Pedder campaign is having that optimistic project to work towards, particularly in the climate biodiversity crisis, something that people can make a tangible difference in the restoration, not just of Lake Pedder as a geographical icon, but the Serpentine Valley for its biodiversity credentials and the other hopes that project could inspire. And you said before that the right will prevail. Sorry, I'll say that again. That right will prevail. And is the restoration of Lake Pedder campaign's been ongoing ever since the flooding in 1972. Do you see a scenario as we're in the not too distant future where we need significant and ambitious change that has an opportunity to become a reality?
Look, I'm certain that Lake Pedder, I think the original Lake Pedder will be restored in the future, and I don't think it's too far away. And I think it'll be a combination of factors. It's a combination of young people becoming active. It's a combination of the right people being elected to Parliament who can see a broader view of where Tasmania is headed and the needs of the planet and future generations. So I think it's a combination of those things. I went to Christine's talk the other night in Ulverston, and I hadn't actually thought before about Tasmania becoming a centre of ecological restoration. And I think the research that would go into Tasmania with the restoration of Lake Pedder and the study that would go into that restoration and its transition to the old Lake Pedder would set Tasmania up as a state of excellence in environmental restoration. And given the state of the planet and the state of degraded dams around the world, there is going to be a lot of expertise needed in terms of restoring these places. And Tasmania right now could set itself up to be an absolutely global leader in that type of environmental restoration. And it wouldn't stop at that. It could be restoration of forests, restoration of wetlands, restoration of oceans, restoration of Macquarie Harbour, for example. Then it's got so much potential if it's linked in with, say, the university, with other private companies could become involved. And the other thing is it can be used to revitalise our education and training systems as well. So there are a lot of other spin-offs with this. And we would become an absolute global leader, and it would have huge economic spin-offs for Tasmania, and particularly for young Tasmanians. I just think it's such a fantastic idea. And what would we have at the end of it? We'd have this beautiful restored Lake Pedder that I was lucky enough to see for future generations to enjoy, just like I've had the opportunity to be able to do. And wouldn't that be a wonderful thing if we could do that? People would come from all around the world to see this jewel that has been restored. And that in itself would be a huge economic boon to Tasmania. And they could use that then to go, into the Franklin and these other restored places that we're going to our beautiful forests of the Tarkine that I grew up right next to. And I often say, like I said in politics, that the fastest diminishing resource in the world is wilderness. It's a thing that Tasmania has. It's something that the rest of the world is losing. And if we can manage to hang on to what we've got, then it's what the rest of the world wants to see. And they will flock here to see these special places. They're being trashed more and more in other parts of the world. It is a big part of our economic future. I mean, one of the questions you asked me was how do I remain so positive? And it's just that I do see these changes, and I do see I know it's slow, and it's too slow for me and too slow for a lot of people, but it does change. People do change. And I get a lot of positivity from young people. So I still actually work in schools a lot, and I've got a nature-based tourism business, and I do a lot of work with school children and young adults. And every time I work with them, most recently last Thursday, I become very optimistic because there's so much talent out there in young people. And I just think it's a matter of channeling the energy in ways that make this planet a better place. But they've certainly got the skills and the enthusiasm. And I think it's the leadership that's needed to support them in the transition to, becoming change makers in the world.
That was episode 6 of Pedder Unplugged with Paul Basil O'Halloran. If you'd like to learn more about Lake Pedder or get involved in the restoration campaign, visit lakepedder.org. Or you can reach out to us at restoration@lakepedder.org. I'm Tabitha Badger, and thanks again for listening.